record this.
Okay.
There we go.
Welcome, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. It's really wonderful to see everyone for our Temple Aaron Shabbat morning Torah study. And just want to make a call out to particularly thank Sherry, who really, she sends out the announcements. She keeps the trains running on time, as I like to say. And without Sherry, a lot of things wouldn't be happening. That's not to take anything away from Neil or the other members of the board who really work to keep Temple Aaron alive and moving forward. And there's a lot of excitement coming down the road for Temple Aaron. So just stay posted, and we'll be continuing with our regular programming with Torah study and Erev Shabbat, and planning Rosh Hashanah services. And they say there's a lot to look forward to. This is an interesting point in the Jewish calendar, because tonight, right at the end of Shabbat, we begin Tisha B'Av. And today we're going to do a review of what Tisha B'Av is all about, the rituals, the practices, the history. And then we're going to actually get in, I think, to the more important part of our learning is a delving into some questions that are posed by Tisha B'Av, and that are, I would call them, I used to call them when I was younger, ultimate questions, having to do with the nature of life and the universe and suffering and justice and things of that sort that our tradition very much likes to talk about. And that really comes into focus around Tisha B'Av. So with that, what we're going to do is I actually used to have this little tiny PowerPoint presentation that talked about the rubrics. I could not find it. So what I decided to do, let's do this, is
Sharing.
I found online this really quite wonderful presentation put together actually by 3 students, which we're going to run through some of this to talk about the basics of Tisha B'Av. And I commend the students, Leah, Martha, and Matthew, for doing such a nice job with this presentation. It's all the information I would have been sharing with you, but I like the way they've designed it. So what is Tisha B'Av? So first of all, Tisha B'Av, kind of like a Shabbat, lasts 25 hours, not 24 hours. So Shabbat is usually extended by an extra hour because we don't want the sweetness and the special spiritual quality of Shabbat to end abruptly. We want it to linger a little bit. And because we say on Shabbat, we receive an extra soul, a little extra part, a piece, an aspect of soul enters us during Shabbat. And it's what helps create that feeling of peace and serenity that many feel when they recognize Shabbat in their life practices. And so the tradition says not 24 hours, but 25 hours. So it should linger. We get a little extra measure of the sweetness of Shabbat. And likewise with Tisha B'Av, because it is it's a fast day, it's a tremendous day of sadness, which we're going to look at right now, because there's so much earnestness in the grieving and mourning associated with Tisha B'Av. It also gets 1 extra hour of sadness. And so it's 25 hours starting tonight after Shabbat. And as I'm assuming you all do know, that Tisha B'Av is an annual fast day in Judaism, it takes place on the 9th of Av. Tisha is the number 9, B'Av of Av. Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, on which a number of disasters occurred in Jewish history. Now, this year, of course, it begins tonight. When this presentation was first given, it was July 31st to August 1st. So I wasn't able to edit that, but that's the 9th day of Av, of course, is the Jewish calendar. And we know that in the syncing of the Jewish calendar and the secular solar calendar, the holidays fluctuate a little bit in both directions, right? And just remember the math, the reason for that. So our calendar is a lunar calendar, and 12 lunar months adds up to 354 days and a smidgen of a day, whereas the solar calendar is 365 days. So you have this gap. And so that's why our holidays are always moving, but we don't let them move too far. We reset with a leap year 7 times in every 19 years. We kind of add an extra month, one thing we do, which is the 2nd month of Adar, 7 times in 19 years. And we keep the holidays, for the most part, within a month of space, moving back and forth. The holidays stay associated with their appropriate seasons of the cosmic calendar, if you will. And so Tisha B'Av is regarded as the saddest day in the Jewish calendar. Now, there are other fast days, and there are other times when we raise issues of sadness or grief. But the way history has manifested itself, it eventually it was believed that is a day that was destined for tragedy, not just a day looking backwards, but a day of tremendous amount of angst and anticipation about so many things on this day happened in the past. And this day is set apart as a day when things may happen in the future. Whoops. So what actually happened on the 9th of Av, and if you go online and you Google this, you look around, you read, you can come up with a long list of things connected to Tisha B'Av, or have happened around the 9th of Av within a day or two in either direction. Or you can then find what actually Jewish tradition states are at the origin of Tisha B'Av. And there are a myriad of tragic events that shape Jewish history on the 9th of Av, and they are often called the 5 misfortunes. And the 5 misfortunes listed right here, the Jews of the generation of Moses many of them were banned from entering the promised land. Why? Because if you remember the story, Moses sends spies over to the land of Israel. They're getting close to the Jordan River, and the spies come back. And you remember the story? All but 2 of them give a very negative report on what they saw and how they felt, and displayed a tremendous lack of faith in God's promise that they would be delivered to the promised land. But Joshua and Caleb were the exceptions in that group of scouts or spies, and said, no, God keeps God's promises. And so one of the calamities associated with Tisha B'Av is, it is said that it was on the 9th of Av that the spies returned and displayed this terribly faithless, evil report. Now, it's worth noting at the same time that while this is considered a great calamity and their generation were not allowed into the land, at the same time, Jewish tradition took note of the 10 naysaying spies, and who showed no faith at all, and defined the minyan, the quorum for public worship in Judaism based on the 10 naysayers. So interesting, and again, it just illustrates to me the great subtleties of our tradition and our history, and how the rabbis, who are the ones to really articulate these original ideas, paid very close attention not to portray a black and white world, although there were certain things according to human justice or God's justice that seemed to be right, seemed to be wrong. The 10 spies in their generation were prohibited, banned from the promised land as the first calamity, and yet a minyan is based on them. And of course, the reason for that is a minyan is, the 10 people needed for a worship service. And what I love about this is that to be part of a minyan, you don't have to declare your faith. There's no litmus test of faith to be part of a minyan. So actually, a non-believer who's Jewish can be counted in a minyan, according to tradition. The second calamity and the third calamity is the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. And then at the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the fall of Beitar, the fourth, and then ultimately what led to the complete destruction of Jerusalem. So when I was growing up, and maybe this is true for you, when we heard about Tisha B'Av, we mostly heard, most of all, that the two temples in Jerusalem, the ancient temples, were both destroyed on the 9th of Av. The first temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av in the year 423 before the Common Era by the Babylonians. And a little bit, I'm going to show you some of the background of that. And then 5 centuries later, in 69 of the Common Era, the Romans destroyed the second temple on the very same day. Coincidence? Determinism, we don't know. But the fact is, history tells us this day, Tisha B'Av, was a day of tremendous calamity. And we're going to talk more about the nature of the calamity with the destruction of the temples. Less than 200 years later, in the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, because the Romans, of course, took over Jerusalem when the temple was destroyed completely in the years around the years 69 and 70. And, understand the Romans had been ruling ancient Israel or Israel at that time for many generations. And, there were revolts, there were attempts to overturn Roman authority. And it turns out that the Jews of Beitar were butchered on the 9th of Av, and Beitar was a fortress in Jerusalem, which eventually the Romans took over. It's said over 1,000 people were butchered on Tisha B'Av in the town of Beitar. Whoops. Now, I want to talk with you now about the destruction of the first temple to understand the nature of what happened there. And to do that, I'm going to pull up something else for us to look at from actually another PowerPoint, because the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem by the Babylonians came about, oops, hold on. Destruction of the temple in Jerusalem was the result of a number of things. And actually, I'm going to go back even earlier here. The destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians and a lot of things that contributed to that serious calamity are best understood by looking at the history of the divided kingdom of Israel. And I'm going to give you a brief summary of what that divided kingdom of Israel is about. So remember, the children of Israel entered and occupied Canaan, the promised land. And at that time, they were a confederation of tribes, and a loose one at that. They were held together by their memories of their common ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now we say Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel. They were governed by tribal leaders or judges for a period of time. We read about that in the books of the Tanakh that follow the Torah. And the tribes eventually united. And although God wasn't happy about it, they demanded that there be a king, and they formed a monarchy, because that confederation of Israelite tribes, they saw what other civilizations had that defined them as powers in the world, and that included a monarchy, usually an army, and some kind of major monument or building or obelisk of some sort. And the Israelites, were good imitators. We've always been very good adapters and imitators, and they wanted a king. And so Saul, from the time of tribe of Benjamin, was selected by God, anointed by Samuel, the prophet, priest, and judge, and Saul became the first king. Saul was a complicated, difficult character. People have done wonderful analysis of his state of mind or tried to diagnose him. He was definitely a complex personality and ultimately disobeyed God's instructions. And the instructions that Saul disobeyed were, if you remember in the Torah, repeatedly, there is a group of people called the Amalekites, led by the infamous Amalek. And we read in the Torah, more times than I can count, a curse against the Amalekites, and that they should be blotted out. And there is a story during Saul's military life where he doesn't follow through with God's commandment destroy Amalekites. So then God chooses David, a shepherd youth from the tribe of Judah, to rule the kingdom after the death of Saul. And we know about David. He's this romantic character. And unless you read those books, he was an administrator. He was a hugely successful organizer, administrator, statesman, who really began the process of centralizing the religious worship of these tribes that were dispersed over this great area, and then founded what was also a political dynasty. He was a poet and a musician, as it says in 2 Samuel, the sweet psalmist of Israel, and he was a skilled harpist. He was a soldier and a warrior, and he expanded the borders of the kingdom and forged a simple agrarian society into a real nation. Now, David's son and successor, Solomon, reigned over what became an industrial empire, stretching from the Euphrates up north all the way to the Nile in the south, according to 1 Kings. And Solomon inherited peace and prosperity from David, and that enabled him to build, most notably, the temple, the first temple in Jerusalem. And Solomon's fame and wisdom spread abroad, and his wealth and riches exceeded that of supposedly all the other kings on earth. At that point, the nation of ancient Israel was a major power in the world, if you really read into the story. But in his old age, sadly, Solomon becomes idolatrous, and we can have an interesting discussion of what turned him into an idolatrous person. But the general attitude in the tradition is it was because of the influence of his many foreign wives, which I have never been comfortable with that conclusion. But the fact is that many of those unions were in the name of military alliance and expanding the borders of peace across that region. But he did become kind of corrupt toward the very end of his life. And so that's the background. When Solomon dies, his son, Rehoboam, this is a piece of Jewish history somehow a lot of people in Hebrew school didn't fully get. This is a terrible, this was the setting of the table for the destruction of Israel. Rehoboam became king after Solomon died, and Rehoboam was surrounded with advisors and patrons who were very wealthy people, and they were very much committed to increasing the centralization of Jerusalem for the entire country. They were very committed to maintaining their wealth and their influence of the insiders group of Jerusalem. And then you had most of the tribes living out at great distances surrounding Jerusalem in the north and in the south. And Rehoboam was very firm about a couple of things. He was going to tax the outer tribes to help support the lavish trappings of this Jerusalem elite. In addition to which, they were increasingly tightening the knot, prohibiting these northern territories, and namely 10 of the 12 tribes, who were very troubled having to make a pilgrimage 3 times a year to Jerusalem for the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Sukkot, Pesach, and Shavuot. And it was at great expense. And because the priesthood in Jerusalem, supported by Rehoboam and his elitist, circle of patrons, they were like, no. Jerusalem is the religious center of the entire country. You cannot build altars up north and not come down here for those holidays. And the people up north were saying, but it's a big burden for us. First of all, we have to sacrifice animals, and you're forcing us to support an economy in Jerusalem because we can't schlep all our sheep and our goats and our lambs, whatever we're going to sacrifice on these holidays. So you force us to make this big. It's not like they could get on the train and come down to Jerusalem. They had to schlep, and they would come down. And then outside the temple, they spend a lot of money buying an animal for sacrifice. And that money, of course, supported a whole local economy around Jerusalem. And the people living in the north felt this was not fair. And so eventually the 10 northern tribes revolted, and they established what they called the Northern Kingdom of Israel. And they appointed Jeroboam. So there's Rehoboam, who is the elitist king, son of Solomon, and Jeroboam, who is this kind of young, flashy, kind of, this low-key, influential charisma. And he was appointed from the tribe of Ephraim as their king. And the 2 southern tribes that were left of Judah and Benjamin were the tribes around Jerusalem, known as the Kingdom of Judah. They remain loyal to Rehoboam and the Davidic dynasty. And this officially took place in the kingdom divided in 931 to 930 BCE, over about a 1.5 year period. So look at that. That's almost 1,000 years. And the kingdom, the nation of Israel, probably had only been in existence at this point for 400 years. And the kingdom divided. And then the first thing is that the northern kingdom was taken into captivity by the Assyrians in 723 and 22. The old saying, divide and conquer. Well, divide yourselves and get conquered. Divide yourselves and get conquered. And then eventually the kingdom of Judah continued by itself for another 130 or so years. And eventually in 586, the Babylonians had their eyes on that western They had their eyes on that for a long time. And eventually they went in, they stormed Jerusalem, and Judah, the southern kingdom, went into captivity in 586 BCE. That's the background of the destruction of the temple. And understand what that actually meant for people. It meant that their center of worship, their symbol of national prowess, was destroyed, leveled to the ground. It meant that the priesthood that had been conducting this, not only this commerce, but the ritual life of the greater Israelite people, was dismantled. It meant that 2/3 of the people were then taken into exile and marched 1,000 miles to Babylonia and held captive, with a 1/3 or less left to amongst the ruins. And understand that it's during that time, the calamity of the destruction of the first temple, when our ancestors began what we now describe as the yearning for the coming of the Mashiach, of the Messiah. The yearning of the coming of the Mashiach means the yearning for the return of the anointed. And when they used the anointed, they meant their king, their sovereignty, the return of their sovereignty. And we find that throughout the writings of the prophets, and as a central theme in early rabbinic literature, more associated with the destruction of the second temple. And imagine a whole society, really almost like a whole civilization, burnt to the ground, and in a matter of a year or two, and trying to understand why. What's that all about? Take that away. And hold on. Take that away. Oops. There we go. Look at that, it's magic. All right. So the destruction of the first whole temple, the first or the second of the 5 calamities. And then we have the destruction of the second temple under the Romans. And then the fall of Beitar. And so every year on Tisha B'Av, we remember these calamities. And there are several rituals that traditional Jews partake in during Tisha B'Av. So before Tisha B'Av, 9 days before Tisha B'Av, traditional Jews begin to mourn. And they refrain before Tisha B'Av from eating meat, washing their clothes, or cutting their hair, or shaving. And of course, we have many different types of Jews around the world, and Reform, Conservative, Hasidic have different interpretations of the rituals. And in some progressive movements, the time before Tisha B'Av may not entail these rituals, but it often does entail a time of reflection and anticipation. On Tisha B'Av, we are prohibited from eating and drinking from sunrise to sunset, engaging in sexual relations, or wearing leather shoes. Leather, which is a sign of wealth and privilege. So we're supposed to, the idea is to dress down. In fact, our ancestors would have put on even sackcloth on the 9th of Av. We're supposed to strip ourselves from any entertainment, even refrain from smiling and engaging in polite or idle conversation, and really focus our energy during this entire 25 hours on the tragedies. And lastly, and I'm going to show you some pictures of this a little bit, we're told to sit on the floor or on a low stool during Tisha B'Av, like one does when they're mourning the death of someone during Shiva, to show how we're low, we're like burdened and pushed down with sadness and with grief. The other thing, which is really interesting on Tisha B'Av, is we still, in traditional Judaism, pray 3 times a day. But on Tisha B'Av, just to show the difference this day, rather than putting on a talit and tefillin in the morning, they're actually worn during the afternoon service, the one time during the year where that exception takes place. And I should also note, down here, the ark in the synagogue is usually draped with a black sheet to cover the adornments of the ark. We cover it in black to commemorate the tragedies. And finally, when we get to the end, we're commanded that we should wash our hands, but we do it in a different way. And we wash our hands as a way of cleansing the grief, but we don't say a prayer. Because even in the last act of Tisha B'Av, when normally you wash your hands, you say, the bracha al nitzilat yadayim, for the washing of the hands, Baruch atah Adonai, etc. But at the end of Tisha B'Av, we don't even say the bracha because we're not in the mood to be praising God right then. And so we just wash in silence at the end of Tisha B'Av. And so those are the basics of the holiday. And now I want to go to really, I think, the important part of today. Let me just share this. And slideshow from the beginning. Here we go. And so now let's learn together and reflect together about Tisha B'Av. So knowing that Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning for calamities and destructions which we have faced as a people, the glaring question to be discussed is, how are we to understand Jewish suffering? And there are different approaches to understanding Jewish suffering, and they all generally revolve around a philosophical term called Theodicy. A theodicy is an attempt to justify or defend God in the face of evil by answering the following problem, which in its most basic form involves 3 assumptions. Even though bad things happen, number 1, God is all good and all powerful and therefore all knowing. The universe creation was made by God and or exists in a contingent relationship with God. Keyword, contingent relationship. And I must say, that is often the Jewish approach to answering the question, how can evil and God coexist? And this usually is the traditional form of the question and the traditional form of the answer. Evil happens, but God is all good. Evil happens, God is still all powerful. Evil happens, and God knows why we don't. Evil happens, it was created along with the universe that was made by God to begin with. And bad things happen because we are in a relationship with God And that relationship is contingent. It's dependent upon our behavior. So in Jewish tradition, when we ask the question, why did Jews suffer? How do we understand Jewish suffering? The first answer usually given is taken from the book of Isaiah. And the answer is, why do we suffer? Because the Jewish people are a suffering servant to God. Our suffering has a purpose. It has a purpose in God's universe. In the context of God, it has a purpose. And to understand what that is, it's explained in Isaiah 53. Now, by the way, Isaiah 53 is used by Christians often who will say, it's not talking about Israel, it's talking about Jesus. Jesus was the suffering servant of God. That's what Christians interpret. But there is no, I must say, from a literary standpoint, a historic standpoint, there's no truth to that. Suffering servant in Isaiah 53 was written by a writer who saw the calamities that we remember, and the destruction of the temple, and wrote the following. And we can look at it together. We're going to read it quickly, but want you to get a feel for it. And actually, to fully understand this question and answer, why we suffer, we actually go back to the end of chapter 52. Behold, my servant shall prosper. He shall be exalted and lifted up and shall be very high. That servant is the people of Israel. And even though it refers to Israel as him in the singular, that's more of a literary fact than a material fact. It's not a him, it's it says at him, but it really, the Hebrew is saying at it, at the nation, at the people. As many were astonished at him, his appearance was so marred beyond human resemblance, and his form beyond that of the sons of men. So shall he sprinkle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him. For that which has not been told them, they shall see, and that which they have not heard, they shall understand. So what the writer here is actually saying is, my servant has suffered and suffered and suffered, but in the end, my servant will prosper, be exalted, lifted up, and be very high. And the nations of the world are looking at this and saying, the next line, who would believe our report? Who would believe such a thing, that a group could be so mistreated and then yet still raise up again, come back again, rejuvenate again? Who would believe our message, 53:1? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? That somehow the suffering of Israel is revealing something about God. And then it goes on and on and on and on and says, in the end, and it says 53:10, it was the will of the Lord to bruise him, to put him into grief, because he makes himself an offering for sin, and see his offspring prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper in his hand. He shall see the fruit of the travail of his soul and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteousness. The writer here is saying that the suffering of Israel sets an example to the rest of the world. And what the reason our suffering is so significant to the rest of the world is that because of our faith in God, we are willing to suffer to show the world the depth of our faith. And that depth of our faith is testimony that God is really God. Now, I don't know how you feel about that approach to the question of why Jews suffer, but I've always had a problem with it. But that is what we read in Isaiah, and the suffering servant is we suffer because no matter what befalls us, what happens to us? We come up smelling like a rose. We bloom again. We reorganize. We survive, even if there's just a tiny little remnant. Sound familiar? Tiny little remnant. Temple Aaron, we survive again. We continue again, even with very little. Now, the writer here is saying that suffering was on purpose, and God set it up that way so that the Israelites and the Jews would be a symbol to the world, not only of the tenacity of faith, but of the greatness of the Almighty. So let's take that first. First approach, or Jewish explanation. And let's see, tell me what do y'all think about it? We'll start with that one. There's a few more. Doesn't it? It offends me.
Yeah,
I
for
find
one,
it.
I could certainly see how Christians take that on as more of a document for Jesus, a singular person, because even in those scripts, he refers to us and we, but yeah, he continues to embrace the he and the singular. So it could raise, a lot of questions as to what the true intent was.
Well, to think that Isaiah was prophesying about a Christian Messiah and the birth of Christianity and the role of vicarious suffering and the forgiveness of sin, Christians read that and they insist, that's what Isaiah was prophesying. But it goes completely counter to everything we know about that time period when it was written, about the rest of the book of Isaiah, which is also very much a reaction to the destruction of the temple, the first temple. And so, yes, it does create confusion on an interfaith level. The question is, how do we as Jews respond? And I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way. I think you know that about me by now. It's not that there's right or wrong. It's just, it's quite provocative to read right out of our Tanakh the suggestion that the Jewish people suffer to teach the world something. And namely, our tenacity of faith in Hashem. And that it actually, the world stands back and goes, you wouldn't believe these people. I mean, it's almost like what the world says today. Can you believe these Jewish people? They're still here. They're still here. After all, and they're still trying to get rid of us. They're still here. And this answer is, and that's it. There's still here-ness. That's a new word. There's still here-ness. And what that shows the world is the purpose behind our suffering.
Was Isaiah doing that for his generation, similar to books that are written for us today, like why bad things happen to good people, just to explain really what is inexplicable?
Absolutely correct.
Mhm. Yeah.
Absolutely correct. And it was a time when the Jews were feeling terribly abandoned by God. And so Isaiah is saying, it looks like you're abandoned, but you're not. And in fact, when all is said and done, you're going to be raised up even higher.
When was that written again?
This is written around the 586. This is written, started to be written, I think about in the 600s. I believe 604, I'm going the wrong direction. Around 480 BCE.
BCE.
Oh yeah, this is in a time proximity to the destruction of Jerusalem. No question. They say there are likely three writers of the entire tome of Isaiah. Isaiah 1, Isaiah 2, Isaiah 3. Each of the third of the book or each section have some nuances and variations, but they're all responding to the destruction of the temple. Anyone else?
Yeshim.
I just, this is not, like a historical or rabbinical explanation. This is how I personally think about it. And this is, has to do with the way I look at the world. God for me is, among other things, very active, very alive. And I can't really think of how to envision, the movements of the good and bad, but I think of it always in terms of an ongoing struggle. And when I think of it in terms of physical terms, and it's not really the way God works, but I'm going to go back to three-dimensional. If you look at, like, for example, centrifugal force, the closer you get to the center of a force, the more impacted you are. And then you can, it's like, think of it in the washing machine or something, you fly all over the place. But by getting closer, you're risking that knowledge of the center of what the force is. And I think that in Judaism, we are closer to God, to the essence of God, and therefore we have an understanding of the true power of creation and true power of life and true power of the force of life. And therefore we are impacted more. And that's my way personally of understanding this, because we choose to get closer to what others need intermediaries for, and therefore we are impacted more. And this, I think, is how I explain the suffering, not that it's reasonable in human terms, but it's reasonable in terms of the mechanics of the large force of the universe. I mean, that's just a short version of how I see it. I just
Well,
wanted
thank
to
you.
put that.
That's
Thank you.
fascinating.
Very nice. Thank you. You always have a wonderful, insightful way to, in some ways, universalize and with connectivity to so many aspects of life. And I know how much we all appreciate that. Richard, did you want to share your comments?
Oops, you're muted, Rich.
The liturgy for the holiday has changed, which shows not for some of the ultra-Orthodox. They feel
Yes,
that the liturgy should stay exactly as it's always been. But the capture of Jerusalem in 1967 in the Six-Day War did really change the nature of the dynamics between the Jewish people and the city of Jerusalem. Some of the changes in the prayers were going from present tense to past tense in just a few sentences, to say that Jerusalem was bereft of her children. Jerusalem was depopulated of the Israelites, to, in making it past tense. And some of the changes, though, in Reform, conservative texts have been more advanced in recognizing the change. And I was reading this in a response that was from the conservative movement concerning what is the justifications for changing. Can you make a change at all to these prayers, which really originate from the Talmud? They don't go back that far because they had to happen after the events of Tisha B'Av. And so I just want to make people aware that the attitude of the Jewish people, or at least a good majority of Jewish people, has changed somewhat towards Tisha B'Av in recognition of our regain of the control of Jerusalem and the movement of a large number of Jewish people to the area around the temple, even though the temple itself has not been restored.
Well, and then of course now we have the far left who would interpret it even differently, that even our contemporary right to be there is in question. And so, but it's important to recognize that while we start off with these traditional rubrics, at least my experience in Jewish life has been the interpretation of those rubrics is almost by definition open-ended. And that's why we talk about writing modern midrash and stories, interpretations. And one of the ways we merge this openness to interpretation, to change, and rooted in tradition is using an Orthodox principle, actually, which says that all of Jewish knowledge, past, present, and future, was all revealed on Mount Sinai at the same moment, not just the 5 books of Moses. And that it was all handed down, as it says at the beginning of Pirkei Avot, from Moses eventually to the Great Assembly. And along the way, there's an assumption that there may be changes. And, you know, one of the differences between particularly the ultra-traditional mindset and the more progressive mindset is, you know, the ultra-traditionalists believe the further we get away from Sinai, the less authentic Judaism becomes. So, you know, you can understand in ultra-Orthodoxy this constant, I don't want to say turn the clock back. I reserve that for other offenders, but a desire to stay deeply connected to, as we said, like the vortex, the Archimedean point, the point of origin, if you will, of the meeting, the theophany between God and the Jewish people on Sinai. And a lot more is revealed in that moment, just the 5 books of Moses. So even the progressive view of an open-ended process of pull, of going back and forth and reinterpreting or trying to understand the meaning of our sacred texts, Richard, you so very beautifully pointed out that this day of Tisha B'Av, and it's interesting because I'm going to end today with something along the lines you're suggesting, Richard, which is a more positive view of Tisha B'Av, which may sound silly, but hopefully you won't think so. So I want to go back now. I want to go to the second explanation. We did a good job on the first. The second, why did Jews suffer, is often described from a principle in Kabbalah called Hester Panim. And in Kabbalistic thought, there is this idea of Hester Panim, which is the hiding of God's face or presence. And it is expressing the idea that God actually hides at times. Why? According to Kabbalah, because of our failure to embrace and cultivate holiness. It promotes the idea of estrangement. And estrangement meaning that when we are estranged from God, it is because we are the ones hiding, not God. Also suggests when we're estranged from family or friends, the thinking goes, we're the ones hiding from them. And so this notion of bad things happen because we've pushed God out of the equation. And when we, if you will, the antidote to Jewish suffering is to overcome estrangement and, you know, change our part of the equation in terms of God's presence or God's hiding. And as I thought about it, I went on and said that, you know, what does it mean for us to be estranged in a way that God is no longer present to us? And I thought about the notion of forgetfulness. Could it be that our ancestors had a temple, but had completely forgotten that God was found there? And do we, in a sense, risk the same? if we forget that there truly is a God at the heart of the universe, if we forget that our sense of reverence is a measure of what makes us more than mammals with a higher brain, if we forget that we are spiritual creatures, what is left? Simply a shell, a vessel, or a building, when what we yearn for is an identity, a place, and a home. And the way to restore those things and to undo the estrangement and to prevent God's, hiding, has to do with us. Whoops, hold on. And so I want to propose to you another view of Tisha B'Av. On Tisha B'Av, we're called to remember the exiles which have been perpetrated. But what I want to suggest is perhaps we are the ones in exile because we have exiled ourselves. And most importantly so because I don't mean all of us, I'm using the royal we, because we have forgotten about God and in fact exiled God. And God is now hidden, not as Kabbalah suggests by God's choice, but by our choice. And so another view is, rather than conduct Tisha B'Av as a day of grief for the destruction of buildings and the wanderings of people only, maybe we could think also of Tisha B'Av as a day of welcoming God back into our lives. And so to get at that, I asked myself the question, what Jewish symbol is most of all a reminder of God's presence in our lives? I'll take a poll on this one. What Jewish symbol? We have so many symbols, you know them. We use them all the time. What Jewish symbol? The mezuzah? Okay, anyone else?
I guess I've always seen the Star of David as, the center, presumably being God, and all the points directing towards the rest of the universe, everyone else around, all of us.
Okay, anyone else?
I guess to me, it's the high
Okay.
that John wears around his neck every day and never
Okay.
takes it off, that it's a reminder. So I look at that, the high.
Because understand what I'm suggesting here is, as opposed to even dealing with the question of why Jews suffer, I'm replacing that question and asking, why are we estranged from God? In whatever way we are as individuals, or maybe our people is, I don't know the answer to that. I can only reflect on my own life and say, what are the ways that I have distanced myself from God? And while Tisha B'Av is a recognition of, the suffering perpetrated on our people by others, and tradition's response to that saying, that's okay, you're setting a good example for the world because of your resilience. I'm saying, as Richard was suggesting, as we adapt Jewish history and we adapt Jewish understanding and we adapt some of our prayers and because the circumstances have changed, Jerusalem is back in our life now. So that's one step closer, if you will, to being connected to our origins and the original experience of Hashem. I'm saying that if we only look at the destruction and the pain and the sorrow and not take a look at our role as people, as Jews, in pushing God out, then why are we even doing the remembrance of the tragedies to begin with? Like, why remember these tragedies? For what reason?
Mhm.
Just so we can have one day to feel crummy? Or we can grieve the losses of history? I mean, there's got to be a positive other side of the coin. And I think the other side of the coin is, in addition to remembering and reading Echa and Lamentations and the rituals we described, it's also a time, as a little Yom Kippur in this, to reflect on our proximity with God. Because remember, Yom Kippur is the day of the year. It's all about our proximity and our relationship with God. And I'll remind you this, and you'll hear it when I talk about it at Rosh Hashanah, because I talk about it every year, because it's worth reminding. You know, it's called, in the rabbis called it Yom HaKippurim, the day of at-one-ments, plural, because it's not only a day where we're trying to get in closer proximity to God, but God is also trying to get in closer proximity to us. And so, and of course, I'm always reminded, and when we sold our house, I had this someone had a picture. I had this gigantic picture of the frame in the Sistine Chapel, where it shows at the point of creation of Adam, God is reaching out to Adam like this, like with the finger all the way out. And Adam is like lying back going, okay, I'm here. Like, not even an outstretched hand on the part of Adam in that picture. And I always say that is so indicative of the real nature of spiritual estrangement. You know, God is trying, as we would say in Boston, wicked hard to be in contact with us. And like, we're like, okay, I'll do a little, we'll try a little bit. And that's not a judgment of anyone in particular. It's just an observation of generally the human condition. And so I like to see Tisha B'Av be more, if we're going to go through the exercise of grieving and mourning and that depth, we need to do something in addition to that. And I'm going to tell you my answer to this question. So I said to myself, what Jewish symbol it would be a reminder of that God is present in proximity to us? And my answer is the mezuzah.
Oh.
My answer is the mezuzah, and I'm gonna tell you why. Every mezuzah is a sign that God is present in the place where it is found. So you put a mezuzah on the front of your door, side, the lintel of your door, front door. Inside it has a piece of parchment with the words of the Shema and the V'ahavta and sections from Book of Numbers. And then when you walk into a house, as I do, when I see a mezuzah, some people will touch it and bring it to their mouth. It's like this, it's saying when you're walking into a place where God is on people's minds, one way or the other. So if we think of Tisha B'Av not as a day about our exile, but rather a day to remember God's exile, then placing a mezuzah anywhere in our home where there is not one hanging is like opening one's door and saying to God, you are welcome here. And I couldn't help say this, and I haven't discussed this with the board, by the way, because the timing didn't allow it, but I'm going to say it anyway. If you, any of you, do not have a mezuzah on your front door and you would like one, please email the temple and I will get you a mezuzah as a gift from me. And then I will plan a virtual ceremony for all of you who, and by the way, this is not for the whole temple. You've got to come to Torah class to get this gift.
Today only.
Special offer.
Special offer.
Yeah.
But then we'll have a virtual ceremony and everyone who wants to, you know, we can't all go to each other's homes, plan a virtual ceremony for all who'd like to put up their mezuzahs.
Oh, Rick, you got some spares,
I
huh?
have a few extras. which I'd be happy to give you, Rob. I don't know when we'll
Oh,
see
that's
each other
sweet.
next, but
The temple, we have some beautiful ones. Yeah. That's really nice.
But I
That's
almost feel like putting up a mezuzah, I've never heard this ritualized before, but I was thinking, gosh, like they say when you turn your clocks back and turn your clocks forward, you should, check your smoke detectors and stuff. So I'm thinking maybe there's a new Jewish ritual that people can check their mezuzahs on Tisha B'Av. Check your mezuzahs, make sure they're not falling off, make sure they're all solidly tacked. And if you don't have a mezuzah, right after Tisha B'Av is over, put one up. Of course, some people put a mezuzah up entering almost every room in the house. Don't do it on the bathroom or rooms where people don't actually live. Wouldn't do it in the garage, to the entry to the garage, but you would do it for areas in your home where you live, where you sit, live, or sleep, or eat. So that was just my little twist of thought about Tisha B'Av. So do you have any
And what you're
questions?
saying about the mezuzah, how important it is, but if you wear a star around your neck or a chai, you're carrying it with you all the time, even when you're not at home or not in a house of Judaism.
Listen, whatever works for you is fine. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I just think that I associate it with the temple being destroyed, which was a sacred space that was destroyed. So I'm responding to the destruction of that sacred space by putting up a mezuzah on my most basic of sacred spaces, my home, which in Jewish tradition is, interestingly enough, the ancient temple in Jerusalem was called Beit Mikdash. Okay. The home is called Mikdash Ma'at, from the same word, meaning a small sanctuary. And yes, I think it's great, Leona. You want to wear a star and that's your reminder. It's beautiful. This was just, the star brings God into your awareness and God in your awareness. That's beautiful. And like I said, there is something about you go to someone's home and you see that mezuzah when you walk in their front door. And it's interesting when Jews move out of a house, they're not supposed to take the mezuzahs down. Unless they have foreknowledge that it would offend a new occupant.
Can I ask?
Beautiful, Leona.
Can I ask a question? Sorry. So when you were beginning the presentation and talking about the history of Tisha B'Av and all the calamities and how we're supposed to remember and mourn and all that, like my own head, I kept thinking, like, kind of, it's going to sound terrible, but I kept thinking, why spend so much energy mourning? I can see the value of remembering and learning the history and all that, but it seemed a little bit empty. And then, when you're talking about your understanding of using it as an opportunity to remember God, remember our connection to God, that does make sense to me a lot. Like that makes sense to me. And I'm just wondering, in Judaism anywhere, is there teaching kind of along the lines of your understanding of that, or not really? Is that kind of your interpretation?
Well, no, that's really that Kabbalistic idea, that the original idea of God's hiding from humanity because of humanity's misdeeds. Or at some point, it's like you just have to God just has to turn God's face away from it because it's so hard to see. All I've added is a layer onto that, saying that what God is really reacting to is, that we're not available to God because God is not being made available by us. So the antidote is we have to do more to make God more available to us. And that has a lot more to do with us than it does with God.
Mhm.
Just want to see something. Yeah, I
guess
want to let me just show you this in answer to your question, Sherry. I skipped the slide, but I'm going to go back to it. Elie Wiesel tells a story of the day man came before God on his heavenly throne and said to him, sorry, it's an old story written in not gender neutral language. Which do you think is harder to be, man or to be God? Being God is much harder, God answered. I have the whole universe to worry about, planets and galaxies. All you have to worry about is your family and your job. True enough, said the man, but you have infinite time and infinite power. The hard part is not doing the job, but doing it within the limits of human strength and the human lifespan. God answered, you don't know what you're talking about. It's much harder to be God. Man replied, I don't know how you can say that so confidently when you've never been human and I've never been God. What do you say we change places for just 1 second so you can know the feeling of being man and I can know what it feels like to be God just for 1 second. That's all. And then we'll change back. God didn't want to, but man kept begging and pleading, and finally God relented. They changed places. Man became God and God became man. Then God wanted to switch back. And the man said, no, I'm God and I choose to stay as God. And that's how the story ends. So what Wiesel is saying, man has made himself into God and God is in exile. So.
Wow.
And I think all I'm really suggesting is that the reason we look at all of the suffering of our ancestors and these calamities is, number one, to try to evoke some empathy on our part for really what they went through, which is really beyond most of our experiences. And secondly, we go through these rituals of grieving as a forced kind of acts of humility. And those acts of humility may help us have a much better perspective on our place in the universe, as opposed to the people, we see them every day in the news, who use religion out of spiritual arrogance to try to have power over others. And Wiesel is saying the people that do that, they're really the one they're trying to have power over is God, because they're claiming they own God. And I'm just saying maybe Tisha B'Av is part of a resetting process. Every year we have to like put ourselves in our proper place in the scheme of things and make more space within ourselves or within our homes to allow the divine to come in. Because I think at the heart of Tisha B'Av is this notion that exile is at the heart of exile is a condition of the human soul. It's not about just being kicked out of a country and taken away and exiled in the destruction of things we value. It goes much deeper than that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think we get disconnected from God. I'm not so sure I believe God hides from us, but I think we sure disconnect from.
I could see him closing his eyes though in disbelief. Oy vey, what have I created?
Shaking my head. I said,
Rob, your bandwidth is not the best today.
Oh, I'm not running this call, so
yeah, no, I think your internet connection's just not as strong as when
Yeah,
you're in
just
other
not.
places. That's all.
Yeah,
I'm
you're cut out a few times.
That's all right. It'll change soon. I know.
any last comments for today?
Oh, it's really interesting. I mean, thank you for presenting this.
Thank you very much. I really
Yeah.
enjoy these
Thanks, Rob.
very much.
It's impactful. I mean, I feel like what you're saying really affects a change in me, which is very good. And when you said a symbol, I also thought it might not be a symbol. It might be like the Havta, from the Shema. You shall love, to really kind of be aware of that and the meaning of that throughout the day, or at least some point during the day.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I was gonna say, I think we all have the choice. Either we live in connection with God, or we forget it or turn away. I just think that's our choice. And when we are in that place of remembering and connecting, then we can be in a place of love and acceptance and forgiveness and all those things. And when we forget that or disconnect, that's when all these pretty bad things happen. And I don't know, it's a good reminder. I appreciate it.
Let me say something else. In theology, systematic study of the relationship between God and humans, let's say according to Maimonides, Rambam, it's probably not proper for a Jew to say to have God in our lives, because God cannot be in the same space as us, literally speaking. Because if God were in the same space, we couldn't exist. It would be, who knows what it would be, but, can't see my face and live. This notion that the power, the impact, the presence is, I hate to use this image, but, I have this image in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And they're standing around the ark in that cave, and then they open it, and these people, they just kind of disintegrate, It's I don't think necessarily we can be in the direct presence of God. And Maimonides would have said, you can't even talk about it that way. So the alternative I want to offer up to everyone, because God is a being, an interactive being, doesn't always sit well with everybody. It's just a very hard thing to accept. I myself have struggled with that. So in theology, they created something called predicate theology, which is, instead of talking about who God is, we talk about God's attributes. And so the change that brings about in how we talk about God is, rather than saying, let's bring God more into our lives, Maimonides and the predicate theologians would say, let's bring more godliness into our lives. Bring more of the things we understand about God's qualities, aspects into our lives, which according to Kabbalah is exactly what God decided to do. God took all these, since God could not be in the same realm as creation, and there is a boundary there, God sent emanations of God's qualities, love, justice, compassion. The Sfirot in Kabbalah are sent across the barrier, and we are able to draw upon those Sfirot, those qualities of godliness, and we can evoke them in our lives and evoke them with each other. And that kind of is an interesting way to get around, we call it the ontological problem with God.
Oh. Wow.
Um,
Thought I affirm as a being, more the spirit.
Right, that's right. Difference between being and spirit.
That
Anyone
raises
else?
so many more questions for me. What you just said, I don't know, just another whole,
For another day.
yeah.
All right, well, stay
Thank-
well, everybody.
This was wonderful, very
Yeah.
helpful.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat
Thank
shalom.
For everybody